I think the world will have forgotten all about me, thank goodness. I wouldn't say anything. Nothing.
That's being very modest.
No. Truthful. That's Daniel. However,
What would you like to be remembered for, then?
as the grandfather of 20 grandchildren.
Not for any of your inventions?
No. No.
Also in the final days of his vast time, lived there in the calm of a Surrey orchard with his spouse, Molly, he felt no rancour, and still he held ample cause to feel so. He remained foremost a soul who trusted that the spirit of the British rests in our distinctiveness. And maybe the moral he has gifted to us who survive is that in the final 25 years of his active career, we as a people neglected his talent. For truly, there exists no distinct term for the brain of a figure from whom flowed an eternal river of truly radiant innovations. He crafted the R100, England's only triumphant airship. Imagined in the 1920s, it ended in the 30s, not via flame, which wrecked so many balloons, but smothered by the heated wind of politics. But it was not lost time to Barnes Wallis. Applying the like principle of building, steel intertwined like wickerwork, he went on to model the Wellesley and the Wellington bomber, that most triumphant maid of all tasks, the sole bomber to stay in combat for all the 6 years of the fight. His toil on the Wellington had concluded ere strife burst forth. Thus he bent his thoughts to what he termed a constructor's own mode of halting the clash. The brilliance of the bouncing mine, which shattered the Ruhr weirs, plus the bravery of the folk who loosed it, is just a myth, the saga of the dam breakers. He needed to strive for 3 years to have that plan approved, yet when it showed such a triumph, leadership for once was willing to hearken to Barnes Wallis's latest plan, the earthquake shell. The fight done, Barnes Wallis looked to the troubles of supersonic speed. The pivot vane swallow, like the skipping mine, was to entangle him in a time-worn tussle with government, with all these masters who deem it simpler to vote nay.
Well, I once knew a well-known doctor of science who was scientific advisor, I think, to the London County Council, who used to say that 999 inventions out of every 1,000 submitted to him were quite useless. So, by turning down every single one, he was only wrong once in 1,000 times, and people forgot that, and he got a reputation for being absolutely infallible.
In 1966, he showed a journalist his home on the Surrey Downs, an inventor's place full of labour-saving concepts.
You see, I've made a sliding door here which runs on tram wheels so that you can get into the kitchen or living room quite easily without going all round.
Just tram wheels up there?
Just tram wheels, rubber-tired tram wheels, yes. Yes. And here you may be interested to see this model of the R100.
He owned a custom of handing over most of his keepsakes, involving a prize of £10,000, granted to him by the state in face of government resistance for his toil on the dam-breaking shell. Citing a scripture verse, "Is not this the blood of the souls who stood in danger of their days?" he sent the funds to his past school, Christ's Hospital, to be utilised for the schooling of the boys of RAF folk who had given their lives.
That's a bit of my own carving.
A sketch of his spouse, Molly, whilst she was feeding their little boy. Once they wedded, she was 20, he was 36. Saturday Eve at the Wallis house in a cosy Victorian set. For sure he was bred when Queen Victoria sat on the throne, and he trusted in much of the resolute Victorian values. His doctrines of trust involved a faith in the religious and cerebral virtues of the citizens of this country and of the Commonwealth. He rose from a middle-class upbringing, went to class at Christ's Hospital, the Bluecoat School. In these times, right after the dawn of the century, the surroundings were austere. Iced water in a shared basin, and the small Wallis with chilblains that cracked upon his fingers. Yet he was trained to reason, mainly because Christ's Hospital had then assumed the heuristic method of learning science, and simply, this means look out for yourself.
We had no apparatus, no balances, nothing at all. And I can remember the first experiment that we had to do was this. We were given a number of empty round tins, cigarette tins, cocoa tins, what have you, and told to measure the circumference and the diameter and see if we could find out anything about them. Well, of course, what we were really trying to determine was the value of pi. Everybody's heard of pi r squared, you know, but a child of 12 hasn't. And we did get pretty consistent results. We found that whatever the diameter of the tin was, the ratio between the diameter and the circumference was the same, within the limits of accuracy that you can measure the length of a piece of string.
How long did it take you to find out?
Oh, several weeks. Oh, weeks.
But isn't this a very slow way of discovering pi?
You are not there to discover pi, really. You can get that in a book of mathematical tables to about 700 places of decimals if you wanted. What you were doing was developing your own powers of thought and learning to make experiments to find out something for yourself. That was the real object behind the whole thing, not to learn the facts, oh no.
All you knew was how to go on battling away at the problem.
Battling away at problems which occurred in your life, yes. And I think that that is an absolutely invaluable form of education. But Christ's Hospital, independent as we are, and entirely self-supporting, Christ's Hospital could not withstand the modern urge to test a child's knowledge by setting him to answer questions in an examination. And to a large extent, they had to give up the heuristic method. I couldn't pass London Matric when I left school because I tried and failed.
Thus he turned an assistant, commencing toil at 6 o'clock in the dawning, crafting a warship on the Thames. Once toil grew slow there, he quit base and moved to Cowes, and in his free hours he went for cross-country jogs upon the Isle of Wight. Yet his job was making torpedo ships and destroyers, tasks that were not precisely high-paying.
I started at the Thames Engineering Works at 4 shillings a week, and by the time I'd finished my apprenticeship, I had got up to 10 shillings a week. I was then given a job in the drawing office at 25 shillings a week and started sending money home.
How much of your 25 shillings did you send home?
My lodgings cost me 13 shillings a week, including laundry. And I suppose I sent 5 or 6 shillings a week home. Yes. My mother was an invalid, you see, and my father had polio and was paralyzed, so they were not well off.
Yet the menace of the German airships and the incoming fight were to alter his path. The fleet wanted balloons, and they recalled a planner named Pratt, who'd held the audacity to predict tragedy for the fleet's first entry into the sky. The layout of the #1 solid fleet balloon, famed as the Mayfly, was cut and altered so much that Pratt forecasted she would crack her spine. The fleet stared at the remains and deemed that the full project had been the deed of a madman. Yet inside a few years, they were pushed by the Zeppelin's triumph to muse again. They recalled the arrogant Pratt, and they traced him on the Isle of Wight, toiling and going for cross-country jogs with Barnes Wallis.
When we said goodbye, I say, old chap, if you see a job for me, let me know, won't you? And to my astonishment, 6 months later, I got a letter offering me the post of his assistant chief designer at the magnificent salary of 35 shillings a week.
They toiled on the layout of the R9, quiet in a small bureau in Victoria Street. Right at the instant when they thought that they had conquered the complexities, the Admiralty cried, "Stop!"
And when Churchill stopped the building of the R9 at the beginning of the war, because everybody thought, if you read Lord Tedder's memoirs, you will see that everybody thought the war would be over in 3 or 4 months.
This is the 1418 war.
This is the 1418 war, of course. And so the airship was stopped, and Pratt and I shot off and enlisted in the Artists' Rifles, which, by the way, is the same regiment as Mr. Harold Macmillan enlisted in. Do you remember?
Yes, indeed.
And after we'd served for 9 months in the army, somebody discovered that the war wasn't yet over. And so they said, "Where are those chaps who were designing that airship?" And dug out Pratt and myself, put us into the Royal Naval Air Service, thinking that I could go up to Barrow and finish the design of the ship, all dressed up in naval uniform, and that Vickers Barrow wouldn't have any of it. So that I was promptly kicked out of the RNAS and told to get back to my job as a civilian. To be presented with white feathers by enthusiastic young ladies. Oh, you're too young to remember all that.
Pale plumage, the mark of weakness, for a soul who was resting on head of his latest balloon, proving a gun with thousands of cubic feet of bursting hydrogen under him. Yet the fight drew to a close, and fast following, the financial stagnation stopped all toil on balloons. Barnes Wallis was void of a post. Balloons had cast him down twice. He needed to begin anew.
I came to London, took a bed sitting room and a correspondence course in the Faculty of Engineering, and took my degree in 5 months' time. A shocking thing to do by any standard today.
Well, what did you do after you'd got a degree?
Went out quite unexpectedly as senior mathematical master to a school in Switzerland in order to polish up my French and German, as airships having let me down, as I thought, twice, I would become an international salesman. And so the ability to speak French and German fluently would have been a great asset to me. But I found, alas, that the salary which I received for teaching these children did not suffice to pay the cost of the billet de sport, which I was expected to pay for myself in order to accompany the boys to the skiing grounds on their half holidays. So I came back to London and called on the managing director of Vickers, Sir Charles Craven, asked me what I was doing. I said I was losing money teaching the children. And he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to become a salesman." So he said, "Well, I'll give you a job at 600 a year with Herr Lutebacher, who is the head of our foreign sales department." And in 6 months' time, I sold £29 worth of steel rails to Czechoslovakia.
Did you still think you had a future as an international salesman?
Well, fortunately, Commander Burney, now Sir Dennis Burney, turned up at that moment with his great scheme for imperial airship communications. And I was about the only man left in England who had had any experience that way, and he ultimately appointed me as chief engineer of what came to be called the Airship Guarantee Company.
Well, this was a very big step from being a salesman, unsuccessful salesman, down in the basement to chief engineer. How did you do it?
Oh, sheer cunning. By getting a second-hand drawing board, setting it up in my bed-sitting room, and producing a picture of a rigid airship which would satisfy Commander Burney's requirements.
R100, as she was known, was a private initiative. Much of the funds came from Vickers, and this troubled the ministers. Vickers held a dominance in the submarine realm. Were they to gain a dominion in airships as well? To avert this, the ministry made a competing balloon, the R101. Yet the private initiative, R100, was twice as large as anything that had been made prior anywhere in the globe, as vast as an Atlantic vessel, but merely 150 tons in mass. Wallis used outstanding heed with every piece of his boat, sparing mass wherever he might, even planning unique stairs. Truly, the entire boat was made out of just 11 core pieces. Ultimately, Barnes Wallis picked traditional aero motors, 2 to each bay, whilst the R101 was fixed with bulky, uniquely crafted diesels. On a calm winter's daybreak, the R100 was moved out of her barn like a plug out of a flask. That very date, she drifted gently up on her debut launch, a murmuring, fine triumph. She held 50% more rise than the R101, was quicker, simpler to manage, and she was pleasant. The main room and the traveller suites were inside the frame. On the steps, Neville Shute, Norway, Barnes Wallis's lead computer, later the known author. He portrayed Wallis as the grandest designer in England. Her testing trip was to Canada. Whilst the R101 had to go back into her barn to be granted added rise, Barnes Wallis's R100 drifted across to Montreal, 78 hours out from Britain, and a gale safely survived en route. And her enemy, the tragic R101, this was the close of her testing trip. Above France, void of rise, she struck the earth. 48 souls fell. Since a poor boat had smashed, a fine boat was mandated to take her final cruise, to be taken down for junk. Long before the wrecking crew came in, before the R100 had even soared to Canada, Barnes Wallis had gone on. He had gathered that the balloon could not contest with an airplane planned on the concepts that he had applied in the R100. Thus, the wizard of airy frameworks went to Weybridge, to Vickers Aviation. The Wellesley appeared, observed with distrust by the Air Council, termed by them a geodetic hamper, and refused as too groundbreaking. Thus, Vickers, with bravery, went forth on their own, showing that the groundbreaking geodetic hamper could smash the globe's long-distance title, soaring from Egypt to Australia non-stop. From the Wellesley came the Wellington, and still the Air Council was doubtful. Truly, the RAF would have stood in a sad place at the start of the fight if Vickers Aviation, the business from which came Wallis's Wellington and Mitchell's Spitfire, had not been under the command of the keen-eyed Sir Robert Maclean. Fast, the Wellington showed that it could soar twice as far, with twice the burden of shells as the Air Council's requirement. And it was supremely tough. Half blown apart, it would still guide its team safely back. Many flyers held their souls to Sir Robert Maclean's support of Wallis. The Wellington acted many parts. This machine was used by Coastal Command to detonate bombs. In sum, 11,000 Wellingtons were made, and it fought in every region of the fight. Its victory meant that Barnes Wallis, who designed the framework, and R.K. Pearson, who designed the aerodynamics, were unexpectedly free.
The Wellington proved to be such a success that our works were full up with work, and Pearson and I had nothing else to go on with. We shouldn't have been allowed to put it into the shops if we had. So I was just at liberty to think of what I wanted, and I thought of what would be an engineer's way of stopping the war, and that would be to cut off the power supply to their great armament factories in the Ruhr, which involved bombing the dams, destroying the dams, because, you know, it takes 150 tons of water to make 1 ton of steel. And if we robbed them of all their water supply, they couldn't produce steel, and the war would have come to an end.
This was in what year, then?
39.
Well, why didn't anybody take up the idea, then?
Nobody believed in it. Nobody thought it possible.
Save Barnes Wallis. He penned a thesis, a system of striking the Axis powers, and at the head he cited Thomas Hardy. Knowledge is as to severity and not as to length. He employed a fresh mode of making his plan heard.
Well, I circulated quite unofficially 100 copies, a number of which went to America because I refused to accept defeat, and to the horror of the security forces in the government, when they learnt of it. But they came back a week later and said, by Jove, this is the best form of security that we can imagine, because if the government have allowed you to publicize this idea, it must prove automatically that it won't work. You get quite a lot of quiet humour, you know, in moments such as this.
Trials proved that the giant weirs were not even grazed by his first plan, a vast earthquake shell. Yet then, extracted out of debate betwixt Barnes Wallis and his analysis crew, rose another plan.
The only thing to do was to make something which hopped. So I made something which hopped. We made a whole lot of variously shaped balls, and we fired them from a catapult in the tank at Teddington. And we found that, given the proper relation between spin about a horizontal axis and the surface, that they would run on the surface of the water. And this ball, the weight of which you may judge, I have made run 500 or 600 feet up the long tank at Teddington, just kissing the water. It goes until you can't see it anymore.
It served in the trial pool. It served in tiny model trials. Yet would the government grant him a moment of testing a full-sized device? He had started such a stir with his initial failed plan, such a stir that they needed to hearken. Would they hearken now if he told them that he held a fresh plan?
I shall never forget how 3 days after I had handed to Sir Charles Craven my resignation because he told me that the government had complained about my attitude on the dams, we were summoned to a meeting, he and I, within 8 weeks of the final date for bursting the dams that year, and we're told to go ahead. And I came out of that room feeling physically sick. I had won my battle, and I had the terrible responsibility of making good all my claims. And you can't imagine what a horrible feeling that is when somebody has actually called your bluff. A lot of it, you know, is imagination. You are depending on your self-confidence and past experience of successes to guarantee that you can do something entirely new, which nobody has ever done before.
Yet not even Wallis could fix it. The small-scale shell could work, yet every time they released a full-scale shell, the outer skin broke up on collision with the water. Yet it wasn't just the device that was flawed. 617, the prime regiment purposely shaped for the assault on the weirs and directed by Guy Gibson, were finding issues soaring at the mandated level, 150 feet above water. After much training above the lakes of England, they saw that they could run it just fine in sunlight, yet not one of them could run it in the night. The senior researchers at Farnborough recollected some tests with shafts of light. With an Aldis light fixed to the front of a Lancaster and another to the rear, the two rays connected on the river when the airplane was at precisely 150 feet. Yet it wasn't low enough. Back in Weybridge, Barnes Wallis had realized that there was just one answer to his troubles.
To make the device work, I had to ask Guy Gibson to come down to a height of 60 feet. Well, one felt in doing that one was endangering those men's lives simply to make an idea work. And that is misery if you want to know what it's like.
Just one trial, this round at 60 feet.
because there is no greater joy in life than first proving that a thing is impossible and then showing how it can be done. Any number of experts had pronounced that the Mearney and the Ada dams could not possibly be destroyed by any known means. And then one goes and shows how it can be done. But mind you, the doing was done by Guy Gibson and 617 Squadron, not by me.
Of the 19 airplanes that flew off that May twilight, 11 reverted to camp. The fall of 8 airplanes and 55 souls was lower than Bomber Command dreaded. Yet how did Barnes Wallis react?
Miserable. Utterly wretched. If I had known that that was going to be the result, I don't think I would ever have started it. Sufficient answer?
Despite the fact that you believed that it would shorten the war and save other people's lives?
Maybe, but you see, I knew these men. They were personal, if not friends, acquaintances. I'd messed with them, lived with them, seen them carrying out all these experiments, got to know each of them. And I remember Mickey saying to me, as I was going up to bed after having been up 2 days and 2 nights running, saying to me that if they had known that they would not come back, they would all have gone just the same. That's the sort of spirit that makes England.
2 out of the 3 weirs assaulted were broken that eve. Yet what was the impact on the German iron business? 20 years following the strike, Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Weaponry, stated, "We stood in huge peril. If the British had methodically wrecked all the weirs in the area, our metal business would have crumbled." The cause why Barnes Wallis's marvellous device was never fired again is yet one of the riddles of the fight.
After the dams had been burst, Sir Wilfrid Freeman, Chief Executive at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, asked me if I remembered my mad idea of a 10-ton bomb, which I had put up in 1939. I said, "Yes, indeed, Sir Wilfrid, I do." "Well," he said, "how soon can you let me have one?" "Oh," I said, "June, July, August, September, October, 5 months if I have all the labour available in Sheffield." "All right," he said, "go over and see your director, Sir Charles Craven, and tell him that I want you to go ahead." And before I'd got into Sir Charles's room, I heard a shout, "What the hell do you want the services of 22,000 men in Sheffield for?" Nevertheless, we got it.
It was likewise informal. Sir Wilfrid Freeman at the Ministry of Aircraft Production moved on his sole private accountability. Vickers held no compact. There stood no fiscal agreements whatsoever. Yet inside a few months, the RAF held Barnes Wallis's fresh device. It was named Tallboy and measured 6 tons, a sized-down model of the 10-tonner that was acting hard to mould. 617 Regiment, the dam breakers, were the initial to drop Tallboy. Right following D-Day, news came through that a panzer group was being sent by train to the Normandy shoreline. The rail would need to go through the Samoa Tunnel. Yet 617 Regiment arrived there first. The borough was not run again until it was freed by the Allied troops. Meanwhile, 617 Regiment were dropping Tallboy against Hitler's 2 fresh hidden tools. V1, the soaring shell. And the missile shell, V2, against which there was no shield save the ruin of the firing sites. And if Tallboy had not smashed many of them, the destruction of London would have been even more horrific. Tallboy was also fired aggressively against Germany's strongest warship.
On November the 12th, 1944, RAF Lancasters went out on business. The Tirpitz has had an undistinguished career in this war, but in her hideouts in the Norwegian fjords, she was always a grave danger to our convoys. There she lies in Tromsø Fjord. 29 Lancasters are about to drop 5.5-ton bombs. Three or four bombs at least made direct hits. Five and a half tons each. The Tirpitz turned over and sank with some 700 feet of keel showing above the water. One of the most brilliant bombing attacks by the Royal Air Force had been completely successful.
In 1945, Tallboy's large sibling, the 10-tonner, was prepped. Codename Grand Slam, its initial mark was the Bielefeld Viaduct, still whole after 3,000 tons of shells had been loosed on it. This was the deed of one 10-ton shell. 30 years after, the two shells sat outside Barnes Wallis's study, the past clubhouse structure of the Brooklands course. There, following the fight, he looked into the troubles of the supersonic airplane. One of the lasting fixations of his days has been the belief that Britain must be ruler of the heavens, as she was once ruler of the oceans. And that implied a craft able of soaring to any area of the Commonwealth without touching on alien land to refill. And long reach meant high pace. From his investigations came a craft, Wild Goose, that, like a fowl, could change the slant of its wings. One of the chief issues of Wild Goose was that Barnes Wallis demanded that all the trials should be done with replicas. He wouldn't make a prototype to be steered by man, and this, many folks assumed, counting the flyers who liked and respected him, meant that much valued time was lost. Lost, the flyers deemed, since Barnes Wallis had been so broken by the waste of blood during the dam breakers' strike that he, a tender Christian soul, had sworn that never more would he be answerable for a soul losing his breath.
That is only partially true. Professional pilots felt a not unnatural objection to my substituting radar control on very large models, 30 feet span, instead of going straight to a man size when one was dealing with such a complete change of the aerodynamic properties of a flying body, putting the wings at the stern instead of in the bow, and so on. I should certainly have killed half a dozen men, and they seemed to object to this attitude on my part. They enjoy testing a new type of aircraft, no doubt, and displaying their skill. But I don't think any of them realized quite how revolutionary the new designs were. There was great criticism because it actually took us longer to find out how to fly an airplane by radar than it did to design the airplane itself.
This was the most radical of them all, the Swallow. This, the final of his schemes that we will view in replica type, is the first tailless airplane. With that vast directness of mind that defined his time, he advanced swing wing to its rational close, to what he termed the narrow form notion. Body and wing turning an object shape to raise the airship to high peaks. In its first shape, it was fired by missile on the gunnery field at Lark Hill on Salisbury Plain. But when it was soaring so quick that it promised to soar beyond the zone and fall down on some grower's land, it had to be burnt up by signal, lest it upset the growers, who might crack down on the commanders in control so that they would drop their wild hunting. This was the last edition of Swallow, ended by a leadership who claimed that our future stayed with rockets. Much later, in his seclusion, Sir Barnes Wallis spoke at a sermon held in the Royal Institution of what could have occurred.
Now, whenever I talk about this, everybody says, oh my goodness, we can't possibly afford it. Think of the £1,000,000,000 which a certain aeroplane has cost. I can tell you that I have the audited accounts for carrying out the experiments which you will see on this film. Here goes our very first flight. We were so confident by this time of our ability to control it that we have abolished the rudders, the elevators, and the ailerons. The slightest movement of those wings acts as the most powerful control ever invented. Now just fancy a Royal Air Force equipped with airplanes like that will take off at about 90 miles an hour, almost soundlessly, will land at 75 or 80, all fuel burnt, and can yet fly higher than 2.5 times the speed of sound. We should be mistress of the aeronautical world. What a marvelous thing. What a fearful opportunity this country has missed. All because a minister of air would not believe a technician.
Rather, the leadership of the time set our funds into all these costly missiles. Barnes Wallis bore the verdict with unusual peace, maybe since his brain was already looking forward to a fresh notion. Also in his withdrawal, he proceeded to toil, sole in his room, thinking of a craft that might soar at amazing peaks and amazing pace.
We are actually locked in Great Britain. We can't get out without landing on somebody else's territory. And I've been aware of this for a long time and have been trying to design an aeroplane which will cover the great distances, say up to 10,000 miles, non-stop, carrying a payload and without having to refuel at any stage. You are at a height of about 275,000 feet. And you are going at a speed of about 14,000 miles an hour. Well, that completely alters the whole complexion of the world, as it were. You'll be in Australia in an hour and a half quite easily. Go out there for luncheon and have your business interview and come back again. It will make a tremendous difference. Come back again on the same day.
There existed no cash to advance the plan, since all which the state might spare and else was being tipped into a supersonic transport with narrow reach and narrow capacity for improvement, the Concorde. In 1973, he described his own vision of that scheme.
Yes, now you mustn't publish this during my lifetime. The Concorde, in my opinion, is absolutely wrong from beginning to end. The fuselage is the wrong shape, the wing is fixed and the surfaces have to be cut from the solid and are only suitable for the one speed, whereas the slender body theory enables you to run an airplane when combined with variable geometry from a very low takeoff and landing speed to any supersonic value that you can get having regard to the temperature range to which I've already referred.
Well, where do you think the Concorde is going to get us?
Nowhere.
We will never learn if he could have made England the queen of the flying realm. We will only bide with the mistrust that we, as a people, never rightly used his amazing gifts, or that we just used them in fight. And this is one of the very odd contradictions of this soul. Frequently proud, a pride bred of the certainty that he was correct, ever correct, he remained nonetheless a tender spirit, a figure who never curved his principles, a Christian figure.
I find that there is a natural opposition amongst all men to anything that they haven't thought of for themselves. Do you find that?
In an age when the fate of nations hung in the balance, one man engineered the thunder. This is the story of Sir Stanley Hooker. From the Spitfire's cry to the Concorde's boom, his engines powered the fastest machines of their time. But his greatest triumph was forged in Britain's darkest hour.
I think my greatest success was the two-stage supercharger on the Merlin. That I did do myself. And I proposed it, I specified it, I did all the calculations, we made it, and it worked first pop. It put 70 miles an hour on the speed of the Spitfire and 10,000 feet on its fighting altitude. Air Marshal Broderick flew the first one and always tells me about how he soared up past an FW-190. He said, I could see the German pilot following me up like that with a look of utter astonishment on his face. So, without any doubt, I think the two-stage Merlin, which was my first real contribution to aviation, was my best.
Stanley was showing by his supercharger technology how to stuff the air through the engine. And the Merlin power was increased from 1,000 horsepower at the beginning of the war to 2,000 at the end of the war. And by these means, the RAF was able to keep ahead of the Germans. If it hadn't been for that work, I don't think the RAF could have won the Battle of Britain.
Stanley Hooker was born in 1907, the son of a Kent farm manager. He was quick to demonstrate a gift for physics and mathematics. By the age of 28, with degrees from Imperial College and Oxford, and in danger of becoming a professional student, he took a scientific job with the Admiralty. But his engineering career came about by chance. By the late 1930s, the Great Rearmament Program was underway. Aircraft factories were being built across the country. There were thousands of jobs going on the new production lines, and bright young boffins were needed in the design departments. It was at this time that Stanley Hooker first met Ernest Hives, the formidable boss of Rolls-Royce's Derby factory.
Well, it was in January 1938, early in January 1938. And I remember on one of the usual miserable, cold, dark, damp days, when I walked up Nightingale Road in Derby to be interviewed by Lord Hives over there. And I remember wondering what the hell I was doing there, because I had a very nice job in the scientific research department of the Admiralty at the time. And I went into old Hives' office, and he had all my papers on this very desk. This is the desk in question. And he's thumbing through these because I had a degree in mathematics from London and a doctorate from Oxford, and I'd written quite a lot of theoretical papers on aerodynamics primarily. And he thumbed through all this lot, and he looked at me and he said, "You're not much of an engineer, are you?" I said, "No, I'm not." I had to admit that. He said, "Never mind." He said, we can teach you to be an engineer." And he said, "Who do you work for? Who do you work for?" And I said, "Well," I told him. And he picked up the phone and said to his secretary, "Get me Sir Charles Wright," it was at the time. I thought, good God, I hadn't told the Admiralty I was going there for a job or anything of that kind. And I thought, well, he's going to cut the ground from under my feet now. And he did too. He rang this fellow up and they had a conversation on the phone. And he put down, he said, "Well, he says you're a dirty dog because he's just promoted you." He said, "But we can have you if we want to." When I arrived, they led me through this hurricane of activity that went on in Rolls-Royce, telephones ringing, typewriters clapping, great big drawing boards and that sort of thing, to a little office with glass partitioned office, you know. Opened the door and there was an empty desk and a bookcase and a telephone and a chair. And he said, "This is your office, cheerio," and he left me. And of course, I sat there all day and did nothing. Next day, the same thing happened. Third day, I took the Times in with me and took my pipe and started to smoke, because smoking was forbidden, except between 10:30 and 11 in those days. But I started to smoke in the morning, and people came and rapped on the door, "You do that." I thought, "Oh, hell with you, nothing else to do." So I went on smoking. And eventually I got tired of this, and I went out of the office into the next office, where there were a lot of young men, all busy as hell with drawings and calculations and so forth. And over in the corner was a very quiet old boy, grey-haired, and sitting rather active. It was after lunch. I think he was asleep, actually, sitting like this. And I went over to him and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, I'm in charge of supercharger testing." So I said, "What's that mean?" Well, he said, "Well, you know, we put supercharger on an electric motor rig and we test it and we measure the pressure and the airflow and all these characteristics." He said, "And here's the results." And he showed me. I said, "Well, can I have one of those curves?" And he said, "Oh, have a lot," like that. So I went away to my office with this bunch of data, which was meat to me because I'd been trained to handle the flow of air and pressures and temperatures and so forth. And I analysed all this lot and came to the conclusion that there'd got to be certain changes made in the compressor if it was, although I'd never seen one at that stage. I'd never seen an aero engine close to, or a supercharger, but one could deduce what the diffuser efficiency was, the rotary efficiency and so on. And I did this, and I wrote a report. And I didn't hear anything about it, and I passed it to the chief engineer, who looked at it and said, "Oh, this is very interesting. I must pass this to Mr. Eller," who was the chief experimental engineer. And about a week later, old Eller burst into my office. I was just going home. I should leave at 5 on the dot with nothing else to do. And he waved this thing at me. He said, "Did you write this?" I said, "Yes." So I thought, "Good God, what happened now?" He said, "Well, you're in charge of superchargers." And that's how I got my first job. Well, the day after war was declared, a Monday, was the usual day in which Hives held his great technical survey of the position of the Merlin engine, principally at that time. And I remember him coming in to the meeting, sitting down and looking at it all and saying, "Now, we're in this war and we've got to win it. No good being a good second." And he immediately set about the usual agenda for the afternoon. Of course, Rolls-Royce were already set up by Hives to double their output overnight. It meant the men had got to work a lot harder, of course, but the machine tools and the materials and everything were there, ready for that. In fact, the men worked 18 hours a day for 7 days a week when the war started, because every engine that fought in the Battle of Britain was actually made at the works of Derby. There was no other factory in the country producing Merlin engines at the time.
The atmosphere at Derby in 1940 was intense because the war was on the go, and the engines that we had in the Hurricane and Spitfire, Rolls-Royce engines, were smaller than the German engines, and we therefore had to produce as much, if not more, power than the Germans from a smaller engine, and that meant a more high degree of development.
And so we were able to advance the power of the Merlin all through the war steadily, from 1,000 horsepower to 2,000 horsepower, without basically changing the engine. It still went into the Lancasters and the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, the Mosquitoes, no basic change. Whereas the Germans had departed and built the Focke-Wulf 190 with a great lumbering air-cooled engine in it. Brute force and bloody ignorance, I called it at the time, I remember. And we were all obsessed by the idea that we were going to keep the Merlin ahead of the Germans. And we did too.
By the summer of 1940, the piston-engine fighters were flying in the Battle of Britain, while on the ground, in a disused foundry, a top-secret design was being developed, Frank Whittle's jet engine. But his radical idea had few supporters. One of them was Stanley Hooker.
And I had several times tried to persuade old Hives to go and see this engine. And he said to me, you know, what does it do? And I said, well, it gives £1,000 of thrust. He said, £1,000 of thrust? He said, what's the use of that? So that wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, would it?
But Hooker knew the power was there. He would prove to Hives that Frank Whittle's jet was worth investigating.
And so on the Sunday, he picked me up in his car and we drove down and we saw Whittle's engine running. And old Hyde went round without any comment, very much comment, and Whittle was telling him all about the engine, the advantages and so forth. And at the end of it, old Hyde looked at Whittle and he said, I can't see many engines about here, Whittle. He said, where are they all? And Frank Whittle said, well, I've only got two, you know. He said, I can't get the parts made. So old Hyde said to him, send us the drawings, we'll make bits for you. And we did.
The Ministry of Aircraft Production had already chosen the Rover Motorcar Company to make the early Whittle engines. By 1942, though, Rover's management and Whittle were barely speaking. Hooker heard about the conflict and told Hives, who began to plot. He wanted to make that remarkable jet engine. And he did.
One day old Hyde said to me, come on, we're going to have dinner with S.B. Wilkes, the chairman of Rovers, at Clitheroe tonight. So away I went with him. I didn't know what was going to happen. We had a nice dinner. The Pride Bob won, but being Yorkshire, you can get a bit over the odds, you know. And we had a very nice dinner. When dinner was over, old Hives turned to Welsh and said, now look, he said, Welsh, what are you doing with this jet engine? He said, I hear you're not getting on with this chap Whittle. And old Welsh said, no, we're finding him very difficult. So Hives said, well, you shouldn't be doing that engine, should you? You're not an aero engine company. You grub about on the ground, I remember him saying. And he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll give you our tank engine factory at Nottingham. You give me this jet job up here. And old Welsh said, done, I should be jolly glad to be shot of the job. And that's how we got Barnoldswick and the development, and we became responsible for the production of jet engines.
We were mostly young men. Even Stanley Hooker himself would only be 35 or 6 at that time, and he was the boss. I myself was 30. We had a complete carte blanche to do almost what we wanted with regard to modifying the engines. If we thought up some new way of constructing it that could be done without too much manufacturing, we used to get tests done overnight, and we'd have tested them the next day. If it required manufacturing, we had all the resources of Rolls-Royce to call on to get casting, sheet metal work and that sort of thing. And so we could do quite advanced things in a matter of weeks.
Few believed the jet would be powerful enough, but Hooker and his team proved the doubters wrong when the Meteor jet became the first plane fast enough to shoot down a flying bomb in 1944.
We went on developing the engine, and then we were told by the ministry to design an engine of 4,000 pounds of thrust, which was a big step up, twice the thrust. And I was sent to America about that time because we had great collaborations with the Americans. We told them everything we were doing. They even had a Whittle engine. He gave them an engine. And to my horror, when I got there, I found they were already running an engine at 4,000 pounds of thrust, or close to. The General Electric Company were. And so when I came back, I said, to hell with this 4,000, let's design it for 5. And we rang up, I remember ringing up the ministry, George Watt, and Group Captain George Watt was in charge. And I said, look, George, we're forgetting 4,000, we're going for 5,000. He said, okay, and that was all we had to do in those days. Now it would take a year to get a thing agreed like that. We started it in January 1945. We had it running by the middle of the year, and we took the world speed record in October the same year. It was the first aeroplane ever to exceed 600 miles an hour, the Meteor.
We were improving rapidly a new breed of engine. We also began to see that it would revolutionize air transport altogether, not just as a fighter engine, but in transport aircraft and everything. And I would have thought that Stanley Hooker was one of the first people to see this would be so.
The Rolls-Royce workshops at Derby have been producing air record-breaking engines for almost 20 years. It is here that the famous Derwent jet engines are made. Engines that can hurl a plane through space at a speed where the normal smooth flow of air breaks down into a series of violent shock waves.
But a shock wave of the personal sort lay ahead for Hooker. One of his projects, the Avon, went wrong, and he quarrelled with his mentor, Hives.
He said, there's too much hanging on the fate of this Avon engine for me to leave it up here in this damn garage. He said, this isn't Rolls-Royce, you know, he called it a garage. This isn't Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce is at Derby, I'm going to take it there. And I said, what are you going to do with me then? He said, well, he said, I think I'm going to send you home for 3 months. So I said, well, that's a fine return for 11 years hard work with you. I remember saying that to him. He said, I don't care about that. He said, you go home. He said, where are you going? I said, I don't know. He said, what's your address? I said, well, I'm not going to tell you. He said, well, how can I get in touch with you? And I said, well, you can't get in touch with me. I said, if you want to get in touch with me, you ring my bank. I said, but I'll tell you one thing. If you send me home, I'll never work in a factory controlled by you again. And so we parted like that at Barnsley. And I must say, it was a very miserable and traumatic day for me.
The Rolls-Royce gas turbine team at Barnes under Hooker had been enormously successful, of course, and one thought of Hooker as, after Whittle, as the most important gas turbine engineer in England, probably in the world. And when the Avon got into serious trouble and brought back to Derby, it was a bit of a shock to us that Hooker was given a comparatively small job.
Hives had persuaded Hooker to return and head Derby's research team. But the new job fell lamentably short of what Hooker had expected.
Hives had always promised me, he had promised me that I should be chief engineer of Rolls-Royce, you know. And by this time I was about 40, and I thought it was time I was made chief engineer of Rolls-Royce. Not like today, where, you know, at 50 you're a promising young engineer in Rolls-Royce. But in those days, I was in charge of the turbine job when I was about 30, and by the time I hit 40, I thought I was ready to take over the whole damn firm.
But Hooker resigned instead. The Bristol Aeroplane Company was expanding into jet production and badly needed Hooker's expertise. Bristol had run into serious problems with the engine design of their new passenger plane, the Britannia. If they didn't get it right, and quickly, the company would collapse. Hooker's first job was to redesign the troublesome turboprop engine.
It was a time when I felt responsibility very heavily, because I felt I was the only man in the company who had any real experience of jet engines.
In the engine school, Dr. Stanley Hooker, the chief engineer, talks to flight crews from the Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Canadian Pacific Airlines for more and more horsepower. And so it is to the turbine engine over here that we have to turn for the lift power. These are the basic casings of the engine, opened up for your inspection, and over here we have the inside components which really produce the power.
Hooker ran Bristol's engine team in the exhilarating years when the government spent freely on new fighter and bomber projects. When the mighty Vulcan, the Flying Dart, needed an engine, Hooker was determined to make one more powerful than anything his old Rolls-Royce colleagues could achieve.
I remember sending a Christmas card. We were very proud of this engine. It was the most powerful engine in the world at the time. Very proud of it. And we had a picture of Mount Olympus on one side, and Mount Olympus 9,750 feet. Picture of the Olympus engine on the other side, Olympus engine 9,750 pounds of thrust, you see. I sent this out, and I sent it to some of my pals in Rolls-Royce. One of them wrote back to me and said, how does the weight compare?
In 1958, the most expensive ever aircraft was ordered, TSR-2, designed around the successful Olympus engine, the world's first strike and reconnaissance plane. The Air Ministry demanded constant changes. Frustration mounted on both sides as delays and wrangling blew costs up to an all-time high.
I remember saying to Geoffrey Tuttle when he was Vice Chief of the Air Staff, when they demanded 1,000 miles of radius of operation for the TSR-2, I met Geoffrey Tuttle one day on an airfield, and I said, Geoffrey, why 1,000 miles? I said, it sounds like a number just conjured out of the air. He said, "'Tis." He said, "It's an objective, 1,000 miles." I said, "Well, that will mean that will cost you £1 million a mile. For the last 150 miles will cost you £1 million a mile." Well, that was an underestimate, I guess, too.
Within a few years, the TSR-2 had made its first flight and was regarded as a fighter of brilliant performance. Then, in 1965, with stunning suddenness, it was scrapped.
There was old Sands white paper in 1958 which said, "We're finished with man-piloted aircraft. We're going to have missiles. Press the button. No more men." So men were out. Then the Americans cancelled the missile, which was it, Bruce Streak or something? Yeah, they cancelled that. So we had no missiles, no manned aircraft. Old Thornycroft arrived on the scene, or Lord Thornycroft arrived on the scene, rather. And he said, "Well, I haven't got any airplanes, I haven't got any missiles on the stock. I'll order some more airplanes." So he ordered the supersonic vertical takeoff airplane, the Iron Armstrong Siddeley airplane, TSR-2, etc. Old Healy came along, so manned airplanes were back in again. Old Healy came along and said, "We can't afford all that lot. We'll buy F-111s on tick." So manned airplanes red again. So in a period of a few years, we were in, we were out, we were in, we were out. It was more like a boat race than a policy to follow.
Hooker's highest hope for the Olympus now rode with a supersonic airliner, Concorde. But it took 18 years' development, with constant threats of cancellation, before Concorde made its first scheduled flight in 1976. Through those years of controversy, first over TSR-2, then Concorde, Hooker had been quietly developing another extraordinary aircraft engine for the first vertical takeoff fighter, the jump jet Harrier.
We had this engine, but of course there was no aeroplane anywhere on the stocks that I knew of to take it. And I must say we didn't push it all that much either, because I wasn't really absolutely convinced that it wasn't funny, myself. And we were very heavily involved in TSR-2 at the time. But I got a letter from Sidney Cam which said, "Dear Hooker, what are you doing about vertical takeoff? Yours, Sidney." Sidney Cam was the chief designer of Hawkers. They'd made all the RAF fighters from way back in the 1930s, the Hart, the Fury, the Demon, etc., the Hunter, the Hurricane. And so I sent him a copy of our project brochure for the Pegasus, see? And then forgot about that too. And a few weeks later, the telephone rang, and it was Sidney on the other end, and of course he was a very irate character, or could be, or made out to be. He said, "When are you going to see me, Hooker?" He said. So I said, "Well, I'll come any time." I said, "What's the subject?" He said, "The subject," he said, "I've got an aeroplane round your engine." I said, "Which engine?" He said, "The vertical take engine, you fool, So of course up I went, and there I saw a picture of the P1127, which is just like the Harrier, and there was the Pegasus engine installed in it. I said to Sidney when we first put the "I suppose you're going to do some conventional flying," because the aeroplane could be used conventionally. All you had to do was point the nozzle back, and it was just a normal aeroplane. "I suppose you're going to do some conventional flying first, Sidney." He said, "What for?" I said, "Well, just to make sure the aeroplane is a nice aeroplane and everything under control." "All right," he said, "the Hawker aeroplanes are always beautiful." He said, "There's nothing wrong with the Hawker aeroplane. Not going to bother with that. It's vertical first time." And they tethered it on the end of a piece of string, And the result was that when he took off, it went like all over the place, and it was very, very difficult.
The all-British Harrier went on to become an international success. Hooker had believed in it from the beginning. His support never wavered. was his tenacity that kept the project alive.
The world, Derby, America, the rest of the world have spent a mint of money trying to make a VTOL fighter, and not one of them has succeeded. It's still the supreme solution as a VTOL fighter.
The ultimate test of the Harrier's prowess came in the Falklands War, long after Stanley Hooker had retired. And without Stanley Hooker, there would have been no Pegasus engine and no Harrier. And without the jump jet, there would have been no Task Force Victory. In 1967, Hooker retired to his country home near Bristol. By this time, his former employer, Rolls-Royce, had taken over the Bristol firm and was a main pillar of the British aircraft industry. But in 1971, the unthinkable happened. Rolls-Royce couldn't pay its bills. Edward Heath's government moved swiftly to prevent total collapse. They bought the company, except for the RB211 jet engine that had caused Rolls-Royce's downfall. So Stanley Hooker was brought out of retirement as the one man who could convince the government that the RB211 was worth saving.
The morale of the whole outfit, of the engineers particularly, had, sunk to its lowest possible ebb. And there was a tendency to blame one another, I think he ought to be sacked, or he ought to be sacked, and so forth, And also I found that the first 11 wasn't necessarily working on the engine, which was a disaster. And so the first job I had to do was to try to get more people, better people working on the engine.
Hooker was back at the helm, responsible for the success or failure of the RB211 program. He brought in his trusted colleagues from the old days. Among them, Harry Pearson.
He had an enormous influence on the position. He put everybody's courage back. They began to lose heart. He restored that. And it was so typical of the man. He didn't find fault with anything. He just got down to it and made a wonderful engine, of what was potentially a good engine anyway.
I think if the RB211 had failed totally, it would be a terrible setback for British high-technology engineering. And Stanley came back from retirement. He took a grip of the engine and the engineers. He directed them, and he got it right.
The motivating thing is to make a good engine, a powerful engine, the best engine, reliable engine, not to kill anybody and so on. That's the motivating thing. And most engineers bend their life to that task.
But times had changed from Hooker's early days when it was the engineer whose word ruled. When he retired in 1978, accountants were in command.
And we used to start an engine by saying, well, what's the engine got to do? That much. How long does it take us to draw it? That much. How long it takes to make the first experimental engines? How much testing have we got to do? When can they put it into production? And how much will it cost? So we start with, is it any damn good? That was number one question. No, it's the other way around. How much is the damn thing going to cost, When do we put it in production? How many development engines are we going to have? How long is it going to take us to design it? The last question seems to be, is it any damn good? It's all gone round the other way.
Well, Einstein was a great mathematician, a genius. I always thought that Stanley was a near genius. He was very, very clever and a very good engineer. And very clever, very good engineers are very difficult to find. You don't get too many in a generation or in a country.
The roar of the Merlin may eventually fade, but the legacy of Sir Stanley Hooker, a relentless pursuit of power and perfection, forever changed the skies. He was a true titan of engineering.
I was quite astonished to know what it was because it had no propeller.
And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." There was the awful race against time. There was the skullduggery.
She used to say, oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush.
I thought, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
A small English church is the last resting place of a man who didn't just change the face of the earth. He enabled us to see what it actually looked like. His name was Frank Whittle. This is the story of how he invented the jet engine. He overcame all the odds, only to see the British government almost throw his idea away and miss a chance to shorten the Second World War.
I was born on June the 1st, 1907 in Coventry. My parents were working class. My father was a foreman in machine tool manufacturers. I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went to an elementary school there. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small, very small engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that, making slots in valve stems.
In Leamington, Frank also won a scholarship to the town's secondary school.
I was very lazy with homework and got a series of raspberries for that. But at the end of term, I would often do quite well. For instance, I'd come top of maths, something like that. I never did win a prize at school. But I did an awful lot of private study. I used to go down to the library in Leamington Spa and study all sorts of things which are not in the school curriculum. And that was where I first started to learn about gas turbines. I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden and so on, the VCs of the First World War, and I just wanted to fly. And also I thought that boys in the uniform of aircraft apprentices looked very good. So I decided I'd like to wear that uniform and applied to join as an apprentice.
The Royal Air Force, however, rejected young Whittle. He was too small.
I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow and a series of exercises, Max Alding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. So I thought, well, I'd go through the whole process again as though I'd never happened, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing.
Whittle didn't enjoy life as an Air Force apprentice. In that rank, he would never get to fly. What brightened Whittle's life was the Model Aircraft Society, where he became the leading light at building working replicas.
So much so that the initials BWMAS, which stood for Boys Wing Model Aircraft Society, was, most people said that meant Boy Whittle's Model Aircraft Society, because we were known as Boy Whittle, Boy Smith and so forth in those days.
Whittle's skills at making model planes singled him out to the authorities. Perhaps he might be officer material.
There were to be 5 cadets selected from number 4 wing at Cranwell, and I was number 6 in the passing out list. So when the number 1 boy failed because of his eyesight, it made me eligible.
The founder of the Royal Air Force had his doubts, though.
Lord Trenchard nearly stopped it, because I hadn't been a leading boy and I hadn't made no kind of a name in sports, on which a lot of weight was put in those days.
Whittle's CO had a compelling reason to make Trenchard think again.
He thought that he'd got a mathematical genius.
It was this natural gift that got Whittle a cadetship. Less than 1% of apprentices made the huge step to join the elite in the Officers' Training College at Cranwell. Although this was next to the apprentices' wing, it was socially another world, one that shared the culture of the public schools from where most of the cadets then came. In the bleak Lincolnshire countryside, Frank Whittle's life now took a new direction. Cranwell provided a very intensive education for Whittle. For the cadets, just as it is today, the highlight of the course was the flying lessons.
I learned to fly on the Avro 504K. That was a very ancient type of aeroplane, 1911 type, and it sort with a toothpick between the wheels, to prevent it tipping over on its nose, which in reality it helps it to tip it over on its nose, or even turn upside down.
Whittle was soon a daring, even overconfident pilot, and one who had his fair share of accidents.
I have to confess that I wrecked 2 or 3 aeroplanes. 3 at least, yeah. The first one, I got lost and wanted to get back to Cranwell when the visibility had deteriorated very badly. It was the day, incidentally, of the cross-country run at Cranwell, which all cadets hated. And most of my fellow cadets thought I'd done it to get out of the cross-country run.
In between learning to fly and studying at Cranwell, Whittle first conceived the idea that would make him famous. It all started with a student thesis.
All cadets had to write a thesis, and I chose future developments in aircraft design, rather ambitious, and rather concentrated on the engine side. But the main thing in that thesis was that I arrived at what I now know was the well-known Breguet formula. I wasn't familiar with it at the time, connecting speed, range, engine efficiency, and so forth. And to me, that meant that if you wanted to go very fast and far, you would have to go very high, heights of 50,000 feet, that sort of thing, at heights where the piston engine obviously wouldn't work, and at speeds where the propeller wouldn't work. So I started to look for a new kind of power plant.
Whittle prepared this paper during the first half of 1928, but his findings at Cranwell were the fruit of the 5 years he had by now been training there.
My Cranwell thesis, when the professor marked it, he wrote on it, in effect, because he didn't really understand it, but he gave me 30 out of 30, which I thought was quite satisfactory.
Whittle envisaged flying speeds of 500 miles an hour, at a time when propeller planes struggled to reach 150. These machines were noisy and shook the pilot terribly. That's because their engines were actually car motors on a bigger scale with many moving parts. Whittle felt an aesthetic dislike for such power plants.
The problem with the piston engine as you go up height, even though you supercharge it, is that the power drops off as the air gets thinner, and there eventually comes a point where it won't generate enough power to turn itself over against its own friction.
Whittle's idea would use the same principle as a balloon filled with air. When this escapes, every child knows what happens. But it wasn't clear how an engine might recreate such a force.
I considered a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, and then thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away, up the compression ratio of the fan and substitute a turbine for the piston engine. And there was the turbojet.
By now, Whittle had left Cranwell, but his search for this solution had preoccupied him ever since.
It didn't come to me out of the blue for the simple reason that I've been trying to find it for 18 months. But just the thought, get rid of the piston engine and substitute a turbine, you might say that came out of the blue. Whether I was having a bath or whatever at the time, I couldn't tell you.
Whittle's plan proposed just one moving part. This would be a shaft with a compressor, driven by a turbine at the other end. It would work like this. The compressor spins round, sucking air into combustion chambers at many times atmospheric pressure. Here, this air is mixed with vaporized fuel and ignited. The hot gas created expands through the turbine, turning the shaft, and escapes into the atmosphere. It is this continuous force which propels a jet aeroplane along. The turbojet concept brought with it so many natural advantages.
A very big factor in favour of a jet engine was that when you went up high, the air temperature was very low, very cold, and that benefited the compressor a lot. It meant that you could get much better conditions for the compressor. And the other thing is that in a normal turbine, the velocity coming out of it is wasted. In the case of the jet engine, that was completely used. After the idea had come to me, I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
This was Whittle's moment of genius. He had seen the future of powered flight, and he was a pilot officer, aged just 22.
I was at the Central Flying School at Wittering, doing the flying instructor's course. One of the instructors there was W.E.P. Johnson, who became a very good friend and colleague in later years, and he'd been trained as a patent agent. And he became very interested in my proposal. He thought it would work, and he helped me to draft a patent.
Have you ever patented anything?
No, I don't know a thing about it. Does a patent both publish and protect?
That is the whole point of patents. But one thing's essential. File a patent application before touting the thing round, otherwise you haven't a hope. I'll tell you what, let's rough out a specification now.
What? Fine, what do we do?
Well, you make a rather better sketch, and I'll get on with the clever bit, the writing.
Okay.
Armed with his patent, Whittle offered his idea to industry. No one thought it could ever work.
According to the theories of the time, there was this fundamental difficulty with gas turbines, inefficient compressors, inefficient turbines, and the other big snag was the materials then existing in 1929 wouldn't stand temperatures of more than, say, about 500 degrees centigrade. But I knew, or felt pretty confident, that they would evolve in the normal course of development, and of course they did.
The positive young officer also went to London to put his revolutionary concept to the Air Ministry. Whittle fared no better when he met A. Griffith, one of the ministry's top scientists.
I went to see Dr. Griffith and another scientist at South Kensington, explained the idea. It was very coolly received. Griffith pointed out an error in my calculations, and it was all rather depressing, you know. And then after that, I got a letter from the Air Ministry saying, in effect, that they weren't really interested and so forth. It didn't help that I hadn't then received an engineering degree.
Soon after this rejection, Whittle seemed to have more bad news.
After I completed the flying instructor's course, I very nearly got posted to number 4 FTS, Abu Sweir in Egypt. That would have been a real nail in the coffin of the jet engine if that had happened.
Fortunately, the posting was changed. Whittle remained in Britain and served a year as a flying instructor. These were happy times for him. In May 1930, he married Dorothy Lee. During this period, he also got the chance to develop his exceptional flying skills. He was now one of the RAF's best pilots, and was chosen to fly in the Hendon Air Pageants, where he thrilled spectators with his skills at crazy flying. These were the red arrows of the day, and Whittle loved entertaining the public this way. At this time in Germany, a young scientist was eagerly looking forward to his first trip in an aeroplane. His name was Hans von Ohain.
I always dreamed about the beauty of flying. My first flight with a commercial airplane, I believe it was a 3-engine Yonkers, was a great disappointment. It was so noisy and so vibratory that I felt the piston engine and propeller is not the good propulsion system. The elegance of flying is destroyed by it.
The sight of smoke rushing from chimneys inspired von Ohain to think, if that force could be created by a turbine, maybe he could make a smoother aero engine.
High speed was not the primary goal. To me, the smoothness and low noise was more the starting point of my thinking. But as I thought about it, I noticed that, as a matter of fact, it will be capable of driving the airplane faster.
Britain's Air Ministry had declined to keep Whittle's patents a secret. Freely available, they quickly made their way to Germany, just as the Nazis came to power. These patents were widely read in German aviation circles, at the same time that Hitler was rapidly building a new Luftwaffe. Whittle's idea aroused no such interest in Great Britain, and his own jet engine remained stillborn. Yet the Royal Air Force was certainly keen to nurture its inventor.
After 4 years, every general duties officer had to specialise. He was given a choice between engineering, radio, navigation, physical training and so on. But I didn't get a choice because, having been pestering the Air Ministry with inventions, they just said to me, "You will be an engineer." Though they'd stopped sending officers to Cambridge, they decided that I should go. So I went to Cambridge in September 1934 to take the mechanical sciences tripos.
Once at university, Whittle applied every piece of learning to his idea for jet propulsion.
I had got the feeling, rather, that I might be ahead of my time. With the extra knowledge I gained at Cambridge, I did become rather more aware of the difficulties.
Then this letter arrived in the post, which says, "My dear Whittle, this is just a hurried note to tell you that I have just met a man who is a bit of a big noise in an engineering concern, and to whom I mentioned your invention of an aeroplane sans propeller, as it were, and who is very interested." He's jotted a note at the top of the original letter. He says, "This letter changed the course of my life and triggered a revolution in aviation." And it did, because this letter rescued the turbojet idea in this country from oblivion.
The writer was Rolf Dudley Williams, an old friend from Cranwell. He visited Whittle at Cambridge with another former officer named Collingwood Tinling.
And they approached me with the idea of forming a company and getting on with it, and they succeeded.
A merchant bank was the catalyst.
Falcon Partners were approached by an intermediary, an engineer named Bramson. Williams and Tinling got in touch with him, and he got in touch with Falcon Partners, and Falcon Partners commissioned him to write a report on the whole project, which he did, and it was wholly favourable. Bramson's report, you might say, was another of the big key points in the whole story. He'd been very much involved with aviation. He was a pretty skillful aeronautical engineer. And his report inspired Falcon Partners to go on with the job. And in March 1936, they formed the company called Power Jets Limited.
Whittle told his backers the project had a 1 in 30 chance of success. The Air Ministry quickly added another obstacle.
One clause said that I was not to work more than 6 hours a week on the job. But of course, that didn't operate as an effective control on me. I worked practically full time.
At Cambridge, Whittle also had to fit in the task for which he'd gone to university in the first place.
And I very much wanted first-class honours. So I had to work like hell because I was designing the jet engine and preparing for my finals at the same time. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I succeeded in getting my first, happily, and then was able to turn back to the jet engine.
Whittle approached a manufacturer in Rugby to build the world's first jet engine. British Thomson Houston made steam turbines. Whittle drove over from Cambridge, rehearsing what he'd say to persuade the huge company to accept a contract. He succeeded, when all he could offer them was £2,000, well below what his project really needed.
The proper scientific way to go about the job would be to build a compressor and test it, build a turbine and test it, build combustion chambers and test it, and then put them all together when the results from each were satisfactory. But the cost for that would have been about £30,000, and there was no hope of getting that amount of money. So the only thing to do was go ahead with the complete engine. What we were doing was trying to prove the engine right from the word go.
In a cavernous Rugby workshop, Whittle set to work on this huge challenge.
The BTH built the engine, and I stood over it more or less while it was going on. I felt that we were going to be all right as far as the simple centrifugal compressor was concerned. I felt that the turbine was going to be all right, but I was uneasy about the combustion problem because we were aiming at 24 times the kind of combustion intensity that was obtainable in those days. But the engine became ready for running proper on April the 12th of 1937. A lot of people said it wouldn't even turn itself over. What did happen proved the very opposite. I gave a signal with my hands to raise the speed with the electric motor to 2,000 RPM, and that was done. And then I opened the main control, and it started all right. It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. They all went down the factory like the wind. I didn't, because I was petrified with fright. I just couldn't move. It seemed like perpetual motion, but of course it wasn't. The fact was that a pool of fuel had accumulated in the combustion chamber, which we didn't know about, and that was keeping it running after I'd switched off the control. Well, that sort of thing happened day after day. We had about 4 of that kind of runaway. Just after the engine first ran and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth.
Whittle didn't know that in Germany some people were by now far more willing to bet on his idea. One of them was Ernst Heinkel, a legend in his country's resurgent aviation industry. Von O'Hine had been introduced to him.
He was alone in his villa in Warnemünde. He explained to me that he wanted to finance the whole thing by himself if it works. And he said, I have the best aerodynamicists, I have the best and best designers, and I want you to tomorrow to speak with them and explain your ideas. I loved the Baltic Sea coast very much. I sure would think that would be a nice place to work, and so I choose Heinkel. Additionally, I felt I was afraid to go to engine companies. I thought they were too much ingrained in their recip engines, and my model didn't work sufficiently good.
Heinkel's company was attractive for another reason.
The whole development was very inexpensive, but when we would have asked for more money, we would have gotten it. So money was not a problem.
By contrast, the Power Jet's kitty was empty. As the Nazi threat grew, Whittle had a war winner, yet Britain was set to abandon it.
There were several things which hampered progress. In 1937-38, the worst was the tight financial situation. Our financial backers began to get cold feet. They had, quite unrealistically, expected that within a matter of a month or two, we would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere. Well, of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. The Air Ministry were very hesitant to help because we were in financial difficulty. After we'd first run the engine and shown that it at least was self-driving, they did agree to a very limited contract.
The ministry's grudging help only created new problems.
As soon as they gave us the contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act. That meant that we couldn't tell people what we wanted their money for. You can't go to someone and say, look, we've got a damn good idea, would you let us have some money? We can't tell you what it is, but it's very good. No, we couldn't do it.
By 1939, Britain had spent just £7,000 on Whittle's jet. His very position on the project was perilous. At the end of June, he was actually due to leave Power Jets. On his last day there, Whittle had to impress an important visitor with his engine.
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry, in that Pye, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too. When I drove him back to the station to catch his train back to London, I had the curious experience of him explain to me all the advantages of the engine, that it could run on any fuel, that it was vibrationless, etc., etc. And I just sat quietly. I was only a squadron leader at this time. I thought, yeah, you're telling me, old boy. This, of course, was the big turning point in the whole job.
The turbojet was saved for Great Britain, but Germany, unaware of Whittle's breakthrough, already had a jet plane.
I was very certain that it would work. But, of course, you always feel there's a danger. And we had made not too many pre-tests. We ran the engine before it flew perhaps several hours at the very most.
The support of a huge aircraft company had enabled Hans von Ohain to overtake Whittle. Heinkel's HE-178 was ready just days before war broke out. Test pilot Eric Varsitz was eager to take off.
He started and then he disappeared. And after a while he came back and we thought, oh, he's landing. He didn't. He made another round and we said, oh my God, he must like it. But we didn't have the airplane very filled up with gasoline. He landed and stopped the airplane just where Heinkel stood. And he said everything functioned beautiful and the engine worked well, and he was really himself, very enthused. We had a nice festival.
A jubilant Heinkel rang General Ernst Udet at the German Air Ministry.
I learned later on he called Udet and he said, hey, congratulations, but let me sleep. That's an ungodly time.
By now, Frank Whittle had been forced to move Power Jets from Rugby to a scruffy foundry at nearby Lutterworth. Ladywood Works was the name of the site. Today, there's nothing to show that history was once made here. But in these buildings, Britain slowly expanded its jet program.
In 1939, we only had just a handful of about half a dozen. And then at the beginning of 1940, we began to build up a team, and I was very careful in picking real quality. You know, first-class honours Cambridge, first-class honours Oxford, Imperial College of Science. We were advertising. Of course, we couldn't say what we were advertising for. And when we were interviewing them, we couldn't tell them what we wanted them for, although I think some of them guessed from the questions we asked.
Whittle's charm and enthusiasm at once inspired his new team to strive for the impossible. The noise and lack of space at Ladywood forced Whittle himself to work at Brownsover Hall, a country house nearby. Here he worked through the night, desperately aware that his work could shorten the war, and drove himself to nervous exhaustion.
My memory of him really was just somebody always working. And when he was at home, if he took any time off, say Sunday, he would sit in his chair by the fire at Broomfield, and we'd be there with his slide rule, which of course people used in those days to do their calculations, and bits of paper all over the place, working, and a little bit of time for myself and my brother, but not much. Not much.
As Britain entered its most critical phase of the war, the expanding team at Ladywood was galvanised by a new order to prepare engines for a prototype jet fighter. Codenamed F940, we know it as the Gloucester Meteor. As a potential war winner, getting it in the sky to fight the Luftwaffe now became the focus of their work at power jets. They did not know that Germany was by now developing its own twin-jet combat planes at Messerschmitt and Heinkel. The country's prototype jet, the HE-178, had not been a success, but its last flight was exploited to the full by its maker.
Heinkel invited the Air Ministry to come, and the highest who came was Udet, and somehow Heinkel used that possibility to offer a new design of a two-engine fighter aircraft. And actually, he got the contract about 2 months later.
The plane was the HE-280. The Nazis wanted it in 14 months. Heinkel passed this demanding deadline to von Ohain to build its jet engines.
Heinkel wanted things very fast. He was very optimistic, very positive, but a little bit unreal and unrealistic in his time schedules.
In Britain, the Air Ministry still wouldn't fund Frank Whittle properly, forcing power jets to work in impossible conditions.
In addition to our continuing financial problems, we had many others, like having to use the same parts over and over again when they ought to have been scrapped. And of course that was linked with the finance, because we couldn't afford new parts. We had to make do and furbish up damaged parts.
Some people continued to claim Whittle's jet wouldn't even fly. By May 1941, his engine was ready to go in Britain's first jet plane, the experimental Gloucester E-28-39. For its maiden flight, the top-secret aircraft was taken to Cranwell, where the jet story had begun. The Power Jets team followed, full of hope. On the same day, a young naval pilot, Eric Brown, was forced to land at Cranwell. Today, he's one of the few surviving witnesses of this historic occasion.
When I landed, I was a bit astonished to find so many civilians present. And when I went to check in at the mess and asked what was going on, there seemed to be almost an air of conspiracy about the whole place. And nobody would give a straight answer to this.
We'd been out the day before for some taxiing trials, and then on the May the 15th, the weather looked as though it wasn't going to work out. So I went back to Lutterworth.
That morning I went to the control tower to check if the weather was good enough for my en route flight to Croydon, but it obviously wasn't. And they said, would I mind doing a weather check for them? Anyway, I landed, and they said, would I be prepared to do a further weather test in the afternoon?
And then we got a message to say that the weather was clearing, so I rushed back to Cranwell again. And in the evening, Jerry Sayre did the flight.
An airplane was rolled out, with a shape I had, well, not so much the shape, but the construction of which I'd never seen before because it had no propeller. And an extraordinary whining noise came from it, and it taxied out to the end of the runway, and after a while eventually took off. And I was quite astonished to know what it was, because I'd never heard at this stage in my career of a jet aircraft.
The various government ministries refused to film this remarkable event. Luckily, an unknown photographer grabbed it in secret.
Jerry Sayer was sitting at the end of the runway, and a party of us was sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. And he held it down level and then glided. One of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
And it landed successfully, and immediately it landed, it was absolutely inundated with people rushing out and congratulating the pilot. So I realized something quite extraordinary had taken place.
People in the area hadn't heard that particular kind of noise before, and you couldn't really hide it, however secret it was supposed to be. One officer was said to have asked another one, "How does that thing work, John?" And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." Another story was that someone who claimed to have been an eyewitness said there was a Merlin engine inside the hollow fuselage with a little propeller. And he'd seen it. He was a reliable witness, he claimed.
Well, everybody gravitated towards the officer's mess. And so I followed on, and there was quite a lot of hilarity going on in a corner of the room. I asked what it was all about, but still nobody would reveal what was involved. But it was quite obvious it was something quite momentous.
The flight vindicated Whittle. Britain's new jet plane was better than anybody had realised. One event particularly brought the point home.
The ministry gave us permission to open up to 17,000 just for one flight. And at that engine speed, it did 375 or 380. Anyway, it was faster than the Spitfire.
The news reached London and Winston Churchill. He ordered 1,000 Whittles. Alas, the E-28 could not be a warplane, hence the disappointment felt behind the scenes up at Cranwell.
I would have preferred it to have been the Meteor, which was then on the stocks, because that was a combat aeroplane, whereas the E-28 was just an experimental aeroplane.
Whittle's jet served notice on all piston engines, a notice that fast reached their manufacturers. They now demanded their share of a product none had invented, and which they'd rejected for years. Because of the war, Whittle would have to share his secrets with them.
All this, of course, was putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view, and that we had to swallow because it was a wartime situation. And I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Whittle played a selfless, patriotic role, in which he offered his knowledge freely to the British aviation companies. However, they were working flat out to build engines for planes like the Hurricane and the Spitfire. So in 1941, Great Britain turned to the United States, then at peace, for backup in manufacturing its jet engine. The Americans had only been told about Whittle's power plant earlier that year. Ironically, their top scientists had dismissed the concept in 1940. They concluded the gas turbine engine could hardly be considered a feasible application to airplanes. The British government expected to keep the rights in Whittle's invention, and did not intend to give it away to a future competitor. But that's inevitably what happened.
We shipped over the engine in parts in the Bomb-Bev Liberator, also with the team, who were horribly frightened lest the pilot should pull the wrong lever and they'd all drop into the Atlantic.
The company selected to build the engine was General Electric.
For America, the jet story began the night of October 4th, 1941, with the arrival of a highly secret engine assembly at a Boston airport. It was Britain's now famous Whittle turbojet, the first jet engine successfully produced and flown by the Allies.
Gentlemen, I give you the Whittle engine. Consult all you wish and arrive at any decision you please, just as long as you accept a contract to build 15 of them.
General Electric had that engine, their engine, version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of 42, so just rather less than 6 months, which is astonishing. And even better than that, 6 months later, the Bell Aircraft Company had their twin-engine jet flying. It was agreed that I would go over and help them out. And so I went over at the end of May. I went to Lynn under an assumed name. They insisted I use an assumed name. I called myself Whiteley. There were times when I forgot it, like in the hotel I would waking up, sign for my early morning coffee, and forget that I was supposed to be using an assumed name, and of course sign the real one. I'm told that that didn't matter really because the waiter was an FBI man.
In the Great Republic, Whittle was treated royally, and he in turn was astounded by what he found there.
It was most satisfying to see the work GE were doing because, they got on with the job so fast. It was remarkable. And their enthusiasm was most inspiring. And I thought at the time, if only I'd had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, what a difference it would have made.
In America, doctors found that Whittle was by now battling with severe ill health. Back in Britain, the problems that caused it had only got worse.
The engine that was destined to be the power plant of the Meteor was a more powerful version of the experimental engine, really. There were no major difference. It looked quite similar from the outside.
The Royal Air Force eagerly awaited the Meteor, but Powerjets was not allowed to produce the engines for it. That job had been contracted to a car maker, Rover.
Gloucesters were getting on with the job fairly well, but Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do. The situation became so bad that it looked as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back.
Rover tried to redesign its engines and held up the Meteor by 2 years, but there was also dirty work.
We intended that the Rover company should be subcontractors and only subcontractors, but unfortunately they went behind our back to the ministry and trying to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the ministry.
In December 1942, a solution was at last found to the problems with Rover. Rolls-Royce took over the job of building Whittle's engines. But the mighty company would only weaken Powerjets further.
Ernest Hayes was the chief executive of Rolls-Royce. He was responsible for the Rolls-Royce part in taking over the jet development. Of course, he had come to realize that this was the future of the aero engine. And since Rolls-Royce then were one of the most prominent aero engine firms in the world, he wasn't going to be left out. I would call him an honest rogue, because when he was going to do the dirt, he told you he was in advance. And one of the things he said to me on one occasion was, he said, "We're going to be the centre of this job, and nothing you can do will stop us." By 1943, the Rolls-Royce having made such a big difference to the prospects of the engine, the ministry agreed to reinstate the production of the Meteor.
With Whittle's engines, the plane finally made its first flight that year. Yet it should have been ready 2 years earlier. And had the Air Ministry pursued Whittle's idea back in 1929, a similar plane would have been available by the start of the war to repel the Luftwaffe. Lives would have been saved. The war even shortened. At least the work of Frank Whittle could now have a bearing on how that war was fought.
I thought that he was doing something quite important, because every time I asked my mother what he was doing, she used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush." I didn't become aware that he was anybody out of the ordinary until 1944 in January, when they made the whole thing public. And then the house became surrounded by reporters.
We had been working in complete secrecy until early January 1944, at which time, for reasons I don't really know, the British and American governments decided to make an announcement about it. It was like the world blew up around me. The shock was very considerable.
Whittle and his engine dominated the front pages.
Says here in the Daily Herald, "I knew Frank had a secret," says his wife. So the cat is out of the bag. How strange it seems to be able to talk about it. It may mean that I shall be known throughout the world. In any case, my younger son Ian is a far brighter boy than I was at his age. I think he will be a success, the success of the family.
Had you seen that?
No, I've never seen that before. Oh dear, how wrong.
As industry reaped the rewards of Whittle's genius, new jet fighters joined the Meteor. First off the drawing board was de Havilland's brilliant Vampire. The pilots loved their new equipment, although the planes remained highly secret, as Eric Brown discovered when he came to fly them.
When I was allotted to the jet flight at Farnborough, of course it was a top secret flight, and it was in a hangar at the far side of the airfield, well away from the main activity, and there were RAF regiment guards there with guard dogs, so it was very highly guarded at the time.
Once inside, the plane was a revelation to Brown.
We're getting into the cockpit of a jet airplane for the first time. You are struck by the wonderful view, because in a tricycle undercarriage, no propeller or large engine ahead of you. It is quite remarkable. And once you start up the engine, although to listen to a jet, if you're outside the cockpit, it sounds thunderous. When you're in the cockpit, it is incredibly quiet.
Frank Whittle often visited Farnborough to check how his invention was performing.
It was quite obvious he was itching to get his hands on it and fly it. But we were always alerted that he was coming, and a little memo would be passed round saying, would you make sure that the 2839 was not serviceable for flight on that particular day? And because this would stave off Frank, it was obvious they didn't want this wonderful airplane and this wonderful man to be united in case there was an accident. So he twigged this pretty soon, and I think he played along with it.
In July 1944, the Gloucester Meteor became the first jet fighter to enter operational service, when the Air Force allocated its initial supply of planes to 616 Squadron at Manston in Kent. By now, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount air raids over Britain, but these Meteors were quickly put to work, intercepting a lethal new menace, the V-1 guided missile. Germany's flying bomb terrified the Londoners who were its target. In the skies over Kent, the Meteor pilots sought to prevent V-1s reaching the capital. Some used their wingtips to flip the missile over, so it crashed. Around this time, Allied pilots were startled to find themselves being attacked by a German plane with no propeller. This was the Messerschmitt 262. Germany's own jet program had by now advanced to this sophisticated design. It had been chosen instead of the HE-280. The Nazis never liked Heinkel and had cancelled his promising jet fighter. Yet it could have been mass-produced by 1944. By contrast, the 262 arrived late and was rushed into battle too soon. In Britain, meanwhile, Frank Whittle seemed at his peak. He was a national hero, while his company now had a custom-built factory from which to expand. He had a clear vision for its future.
I always wanted to include manufacturing in our duties. In 1944, power jets had reached the point where they were able to produce, say, batches of 40 or 50 engines. And we had a first-class nucleus for proper manufacturing organisation.
Power jets also had some outstanding work in progress. Whittle was already planning the second generation of jet engines.
There was the LR1 turbofan, which would have been the first turbofan in the world. There was the engine for the Miles M52, the supersonic aeroplane. Those were our two big projects which we had in hand.
LR1 stood for Long Range 1. Whittle saw the scope for jets that would fly planes further as well as faster than pistons. But he would need a more efficient engine.
From the earliest days of the turbojet engine, I was bothered by the fact that it has a basically low propulsive efficiency, about 50% as compared with, say, a propeller at moderate speeds of 80%. And so the answer to me was that we must gear down the jet in some way. And that led to the concept of the turbofan, for which I took out a patent in 1936.
The turbofan is a turbojet to which a fan has been added. This fan causes air both to flow through the core of the engine and to bypass it. This additional jet of cold air increases thrust and improves fuel economy. The design had huge potential.
With a turbofan, you can expect propulsive efficiencies of 75% or even better if you have a very large bypass ratio.
As piston engine bombers approached their design limits with planes like the Lancaster, Whittle saw a timely use for his new bypass jet.
As the war progressed, in 1943, for example, I came to the conclusion that it could be the answer to a long-range bomber for the Pacific War. We also visualized it as an engine for a transatlantic aeroplane.
Whittle was already predicting long-range jet airliners and the kind of engines they would need. But it was the other power jet project that would grab people's attention.
The engine for the supersonic plane, the M52, was an aft fan with afterburning, all tacked onto the back end of a W2700 jet engine. And that should have given sufficient power for the Miles M52 to do 1,000 miles an hour. I think it would have done it.
Despite its huge potential, Whitehall never felt comfortable with power jets. It was a private company, but its driving force was a serving officer, and it was publicly funded. The fault lines were clear.
I realized that there was a complete mess from the contractual point of view. There were no effective agreements, and no one except power jets had risked any money, except the government, of course. And I felt that the government, having put in $2 million, that all the companies should be nationalised, forming a collective turbojet establishment, and of course I hoped that power jets would be at the top of the pyramid, with myself as chief engineer.
Whittle's proposal was considered in the high levels of government.
Sir Stafford Cripps, the Minister of Aircraft Production at that time, used what I'd said to get the ministry out of the mess that they created by nationalising power jets only, which relieved them of all their undertakings.
It was expected that power jets would still continue with its advanced engine projects.
But then other firms began to create difficulties. They said they weren't going to have the government competing with private enterprise. So considerable pressure was brought to bear on the ministry.
And the minister caved in to the large aero-engine companies.
So we, the people who had pioneered the whole thing, were deprived of the right to design and build engines. Sorry. That was too much for myself and my leading team members, and most of us resigned.
The supersonic plane and the turbofan project had by then been cancelled. The civil servants found a reason to justify this loss.
Believe it or not, the minister said that people wouldn't want to fly at speeds more than about 250 miles an hour.
As Whittle left power jets, he was acutely aware of the commercial opportunity that was now at stake.
The position in 1945 and 1950 was that Britain was really ahead of the world in all forms of gas turbine development, but stupidly we allowed the lead to slip away.
In 1945, the Allies discovered the Germans' impressive range of jet planes and their designers.
After the capitulation of Germany, I was at that time in Farnborough the CEO of the captured enemy aircraft flight. So I was sent to Germany and to look at their advanced aircraft, and also at the same time to interrogate their designers and test pilots. Amongst them was von Ohain, and naturally I wanted to know what his connection with the Whittle patent had been in Germany. But he was not going to answer this question. He was very non-committal and sidestepped it as much as he could.
Brown flew the various German jet planes, including the Messerschmitt 262. The Allies already knew that its engine, the Umo 004, was a sophisticated axial flow design. Now they could compare its performance with that of the less complex British jets.
So a more efficient engine in many ways. It was highly unreliable. The Umo 004 in operational service had a scrap life of only 25 hours. And the engine, when I flew this engine, I found it extremely sensitive and difficult to handle because it did not like quick throttle movements, either accelerating or decelerating. Any quick throttle movement either way could possibly cause a flame out of the engine.
Whittle's jets were more reliable, but he could take them no further. The course of events brought anguish.
I think my mother was most distressed by what was happening to father. She was most distressed. I could remember her crying about it at times because she would tell me, "Oh, Daddy's so unwell because of what's happening, and it is such a shame, and how can they treat him like this?" Yes, it's very sad for her. He managed to soldier on in the RAF. He was an Air Commodore in 1946, but in the end, by 1948, he'd been declared as unfit for flying, and somehow that was the last straw, and he and the RAF both agreed that he should retire, and he did.
It's been very sad for him.
Oh, very sad, yes. The Air Force was everything to him.
The public knew none of this and saw a war hero receiving his just rewards. In 1948, Whittle went to Buckingham Palace to collect a knighthood. He also had a financial award for his invention, which was good for the time. Worth nearly £3 million today, it would soon become clear he was greatly under-rewarded. He sought a role, but his stature made him hard to place in an industry he himself had founded. No engine maker hired his services.
In many ways, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time. That dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties, there was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up, and it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns, and for years, it was years before I really recovered my health.
Britain stole a march on the rest of the world when it launched the first jet airliner. The beautiful new plane, with its 4 engines, was a fruition of all Frank Whittle's early visions.
First, after he left the RAF, he turned his mind to the introduction of the Comet, and he joined BOAC as a consultant to help them introduce the Comet into service. He was very worried at the time that the thing was being rushed into service. I've got his 1949 diary where he discusses the strength of the square windows, and he was worried about that at the time, and was making a suggestion to de Havilland's on how they could get over the problem.
Whittle's advice was ignored. The comet crashes which followed were caused in part by its square windows. With time on his hands, Whittle travelled and tried to recover his health. He also turned to writing his memoirs. The jet age took off without Frank Whittle, but the Royal Air Force was soon re-equipped with the benefits of his invention. By 1950, the Gloucester Meteor provided the backbone of Britain's air defence capability. It was a fitting outcome to all the secret toil of the Power Jets team in the dark days of the war. The nation did at last build its own supersonic fighter, in the shape of the English Electric Lightning, while jet engines also powered an awesome British fleet of nuclear bombers. But the country could never really afford such planes. They would later play an important role in the Falklands campaign, but were destined to become museum pieces. British civil jet planes fared little better. After the comet crashes, it was Boeing 707 which brought long-range jet travel to the masses. By 1960, airlines were mostly buying their planes from America. That year, the bypass engine entered service. Turbofans soon followed. With their far better fuel economy, they were just what the airlines needed to realise low-cost global travel. For Frank Whittle, it was the ultimate vindication of his wartime vision, and revealed the sheer folly of cancelling his pioneer turbofan. Yet he never worked on jet engines again, and memories began to fade of how the story had begun.
I think in this country they were beginning to forget all about Frank Whittle by the 60s and 70s.
It was all so different in the United States.
They were so much more gung-ho. They were very good at slapping him on the back and telling him what a good chap he was.
In 1976, Whittle went to live in America.
I think he felt more recognised over in the States than he did over here.
After the war, Hans von Ohain had himself moved to America to work on jet propulsion for the US Air Force. Fascinated by each other's work, Whittle and von Ohain became good friends. Back across the Atlantic, Britain eventually rediscovered its genius of the jet.
By 1986, even the Queen took a hand and awarded him the Order of Merit. And other honours came along following that. So I would say from about the early 80s onwards, people began to remember who it was who was the prime pioneer of the turbojet.
And also a man with a profound legacy. Today, we make almost 1.5 billion air passenger journeys a year, cheaply and safely, thanks to Frank Whittle. He shrank the world, but his gift to Britain is less appreciated. Its famous plane makers have departed, but today, Rolls-Royce is a world leader in building jet engines.
I'm often asked how I feel about it, and it's a question I find very difficult to answer. Things could have been a lot better. We could have had a much bigger influence in the war than happened. But when I see what's happened in the way of civil aviation and military aviation too, but particularly civil aviation, I can only say it's extremely satisfying, especially when you see something like the Concorde. And one of the things you see I never foresaw when I was working on this thing is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. And incidentally, another thing I didn't foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain in Cathay Pacific.
Kai Tak Aerodrome at Hong Kong had a very interesting approach, a curved right-hand turn right down to almost a touchdown. And when Father came with me in the back of in the cockpit in a Boeing 747, he was very startled when he saw that his son was flying an airplane at 1,000 feet straight towards the foothills and then making a steep final turn, which of course was quite normal at Kai Tak. It was the way you had to do it.
I hadn't briefed him, unfortunately, so he was very white-knuckled by the time we landed. He was continuing to theorize in aerodynamic improvements and aero-engine improvements until the end of his life. He always took an active interest in Concorde and looking into a second-generation SST, supersonic transport, and making recommendations and speaking publicly and privately amongst the industry to try and encourage the airframe manufacturers to take the risk and embark on another generation of supersonic transports.
Concorde is a marvellous aeroplane. I've flown it many times, but I'm looking forward to the next generation of supersonic transports, which I think should be capable of carrying 300 passengers for distances of the order of 4,500 miles, like San Francisco, Tokyo, at speeds of about a Mach number of about 2.3. That's getting up to 2,000 miles an hour, as compared with the Concorde's 1,350. But beyond that, I think we're going to see even much higher speeds than that in due course. Unfortunately, they're going to be very expensive propositions.
Sir Frank Whittle died in August 1996, assured of his position as the greatest aero-engineer of the 20th century. The Royal Air Force paid fitting tribute to its distinguished son with a memorial service at Westminster Abbey.
He and I had wanted the opportunity to fly together, preferably in an open cockpit biplane, so that together we could loop and spin and climb and dive. This modest ambition was never realized for one reason or another. The nearest we got was when I flew him to Hong Kong in a Boeing 747. On the last morning of his life, I leant over his bed and said, "Dad, let's put on our kit and go flying." He opened his eyes and looked at me and smiled. That evening, with Hazel holding his hand, he died. And I wondered if he went flying, and if he did, if he went on his own, or did he have a companion?
He was cremated in the USA, and the air attaché there brought his ashes over to this country, and I went to Heathrow to meet the aeroplane, and I came home and put the ashes on the bookshelf in my study with the ashes of my mother, who died 3 weeks earlier. I decided to put them in at the church of Cranwell, and they organised a meteor and a vampire. So we flew the ashes up to Cranwell, and they were interred there with a little ceremony.